And so today we are continuing our series looking at grieving. The series is called Answers. A lot of times when we go through grieving, especially as Christians, we just don't really know how to act. And when there's other people grieving, we just don't really know how to connect with them. So there's a few things: regret, guilt, impatience, anger. These are all things that are normal, a normal part of grief. It's not something that means that God hates you or that you're falling away from God. It doesn't mean that your friend is leaving the faith just because they're experiencing these things. Grief doesn't really have a clock to it. It does what it does when it does, and there's no clear way out. Grief is not a sin, and grieving is not a sin. And I think a lot of times we kind of give off an idea that you have to show the world and be a witness to the world by having it all together every single time you go through hardships, and that's just not really accurate. The world doesn't need to see somebody who doesn't have any flaws and is perfect and handles everything perfectly. The world needs to see somebody who trusts in God in the midst of a problem that's too big for them. And I think that there's a whole different attitude there. We're not operating with people according to our arrogance or our perfection. We're operating with people according to our faith in God. And that's the thing that separates us from the world. We go through the same problems. We deal with the same emotions, the same struggles. We have God. We have hope. And we don't feel that hope all the time, and that's okay. Sometimes you just have to give it time. Questions always come when you're grieving, and the thing is, the questions that come when you're grieving is that usually they don't have answers. God, you knew. Why did you string us along so long, God? Why didn't you just let it be done? See, we go through these troubling times, and we want to take out our anger on God. I think we see some of that in the book of Job that we were talking about last week. And we kind of get to this point where we say, why didn't you hear our prayers, God? I know numerous people who have prayed for God to heal, and God's answer was no. And so their response to God was anger and disbelief, because he didn't act in the way that they felt he should have. And these kinds of feelings are going to come. That's a normal thing. What we do with it is really up to us, though. It's oftentimes not what happens in our lives, but the sense of betrayal that we feel of how it happened. When we come to the place and say, well, I trusted God and there was no answer. Then we come to a rash conclusion. God doesn't hear, God doesn't care, God's not there. And we live with this overwhelming sense of grief and despair and regret. And that's something that God doesn't want us to get to. We are all going to experience grief, but we don't have to go there, to that neighborhood. The main point I want to give you today is really a simple one. Grief is a process. Feel however you feel. It's just a process. It's going to happen. It's going to come. Nobody is immune to grief. When we read in Romans chapter 12, I started off the service today with it. It says, rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction. Be persistent in prayer. Share with the saints in their needs. Pursue hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Now, we read these verses and we say, okay, yeah, that's just a list of things. But if you ever stop and just think about this list, do these things when you're grieving too. That's a lot harder. It's easier to do these things when everything's okay. Rejoice in hope. How in the world do you rejoice in hope when you're grieving in your heart? Be patient in affliction. How are you patient when you're in affliction? We think, God, save me from this situation so that I can experience joy again. And God says, I have prepared a table in the midst of your enemies. And it's a whole different mindset, because we want what we want, and we want it now. We are in the McDonald's culture. And God just doesn't really work like that. God has us take scenic routes. He has us go through unfair things. And there's oftentimes no explanation for it. Even when we read the book of Job, we talked about this last week, we get through 42 chapters of this guy suffering for absolutely no reason, and then at the end of the book, we're not really given an answer. He's not really given an answer. So this is something definitely easier said than done. But what I want to really highlight from this verse is, in the midst of all these things, he says one thing that I think is very hard to do, and that's weep with those who weep. Isn't that uncomfortable? When somebody's weeping, you want to make them stop. You want to give a solution, give a correct, just something to make it all better, right? You see your kids crying, and you either want them to be quiet or just solve the issue so they don't cry anymore, or whatever it needs to take to get that out of the way. You know, and it's the same thing we do with people. We see people with grieving, we want them to stop, preferably now. Now, I thought Gracie was telling me to be quiet. She snapped her fingers. I was like, I'm sorry, what did I do? But anyways, and during these times, we oftentimes think we have to fix those people who are grieving. This person's suffering, how do I fix them? But what we're actually told to do is weep with them. Which is, I think, very important because our natural tendency is to try to fix them. Another thing we do when we read verses like this is we go to the other extreme. I was at a funeral one time, and there was this guy, very nice guy, super nice guy. He just retired. He was really heading in directions. He was a huge asset to the church, which if you've ever been in leadership, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not saying people are just for what they can offer to you. I'm not saying that. But there's some people who are just have such a heart. It's just so encouraging to have them around. He was one of those people. He was always involved with stuff, always really into it. He knew what the direction of the church was. He was like, "Hey, that's great. I want to be a part of that." You know, he was just a super easygoing guy. Had a family, had a wife. Everything was great. And he died very unexpectedly. He fell off of a roof, and when they airlifted him to El Paso, he didn't make it. And he was one of my friends. It was hard because I had gone to Florida for a vacation, and I hadn't been gone but a week, and he died, and I couldn't get back for the funeral. But at the funeral, we always joke, as pastors, we always joke about the professional mourners. If you've ever been to a funeral, you know who these people are. They loudly wail at the top of the oh. They make you feel worse. You already feel bad, they make you feel worse. I mean, it's already death. You already feel like, hey, this is something I don't really want to think about. And they just make a habit of getting it a little bit dark and you know. And so they go up and they're mourning around the wife, you know, the wife who's left. And, oh, it's never going to be the same, is it? Oh, you're probably going to really have a hard time. It's like, maybe calm down a little bit, you know. You're not helping the situation. And that's really not what it means when it says weep with those who weep. We're not trying to make them more sad and upset than they already are. Definitely not what it's saying. I think more what it's talking about is making time to connect with those people. You know what I mean? When somebody loses someone, you don't have to have the answers. Sometimes just sitting there is really the best thing you can do. And we turn to verses like 1 Thessalonians and it says this, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, concerning those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope." So we read verses like that and we kind of come to our own conclusions. We say something like this. We aren't supposed to mourn and grieve because that's what the world does. So if we're walking in faith, we should stand in faith and not experience any grief or anything. Not what it's saying at all. Yes, we don't grieve like the rest, but we do still grieve. We do still grieve. We experience things. We have a hard time with it. We have hope, but we do still grieve. We have hope. Death is not final. We know these things. But have you ever lost somebody dear to you and somebody comes up to you and gives you the speech? You'll see them again. You know, it's not hopeless. Yes, I know all those things. And here I know all those things. I don't need a reaffirmation of what the Bible already says. I read it in the Bible. What you need during those times is communion, community. Okay? That's what you need. It's easy to just separate yourself and live your life by yourself, where it's safer. You don't have to love and hurt anymore. But that's not what God has for us. And you get to the space of grief, and the next step is to move forward. So yes, we don't have to feel happy all the time. Oftentimes we feel guilt-tripped into wearing masks of, I'm smiley all the time. You know, you don't have to do that. You don't have to pretend and be fake. You grieve, that's fine. Grieve in your own way. It's not a dishonor to God to deal with those things. We have hope. Yes, we have hope, but we do still mourn. So I'm going to give a couple lists here, okay? First off, when mourning, people do a couple things, and you need to be aware of it because it's not something that you have to correct. The first thing that they do is they say and think stupid things. It's all right. It'll pass. When you have someone who's a friend, they are going through grief, and they say and think stupid things, chances are they don't even mean it. They're just saying things out of hurt. Usually that's the case. You don't have to correct it every single time that they say something. This another thing that they do is they act off their game. They act out. Sometimes a little bit. like a cat who's been thrown into water. You just kind of have to be okay with that and realize that it's a part of their healing process. None of us like being sick or hurting. We would rather it all goes away. And we do the exact same thing with other illnesses, right? God gives us a chronic condition. We say, man, oh man, I have to have enough faith to get rid of this chronic condition. And, it's the same thing. It makes us uncomfortable when there's weakness in us or something that God doesn't answer. We don't like that. It's like, must be a problem somewhere. Another thing people do when they're mourning, they struggle with their emotions. They're going to be happy, then sad, then all around. It's going to happen. Another thing, they distance themselves for a time, which is normal. The problem is when it becomes the new normal. And that's just where you stay. You don't want to get to that point. So if you are grieving, there's a couple things I would recommend that you do. And I don't mean this in a flippant way. I know talking about grieving, we talked about this last week. Whenever you're grieving, anytime anybody says anything, you're going to interpret it in the worst way possible because you're grieving. So I don't mean this in a flippant way. So if you're grieving, there's a few things. First off, don't stop living, okay? Your life is still ahead of you. You're still alive. And I know that it's hard when you're ready to go, but God still has a purpose for you no matter how old you are. You're here, there's something more for you. I fully believe it with all my heart. I know that for me, if I hadn't have come here and started as a pastor, I would still not be in ministry to this day. It was a very narrow window, and God got me through it right at the right time. If I wouldn't have gone through it when I did, I would not be in ministry today. It's one of those things you hurt, you don't want to keep going. You're like, let God pick somebody else out there. And so there's a few things. First off, I would highly recommend staying in the Bible and prayer. It's one of those things you got to give it time, but you got to keep on feeding your spiritual man because you can't let the physical win. Yes, you're going to feel bad, but your spiritual man is still hungry too. And so you got to keep growing that. Number 2, give yourself time. You don't have to have a bunch of guilt trips and all that stuff. Give yourself time to just take it one day at a time. It's one of those things. Number 3, when you're overwhelmed, learn to sit quietly and breathe. Just. The Bible even tells us to be still and remember God. Remember God. When you're going through grieving times, it's going to happen. Calm down. Turn your phone off for a little bit. Get away from people for a little bit. Let yourself grieve and feel. It was kind of humorous. There was a guy who was sitting in a cafeteria. And this is a true story. And he was sitting there crying and just having a rough time of it here in the middle of a cafeteria with people around. And then his alarm on his phone goes off. He stops crying, turns off the alarm, and goes on with his day. I have no idea what was going on in his life. But I just really thought that was maybe not exactly what I'm trying to get across, but still, more a humorous way of it. Number 4, realize that it's normal. It's normal to be upset. It's normal to be emotional. These are things that don't make you unchristian. Number 5, when you're struggling with your emotions, that's fine. Let it happen and don't fight it. We try to always fix it right off the bat. Another thing we do is we try to alter it with vices. We try to go to different pleasures, have different relationships, if you know what I'm saying, where it tries and, try to blind us from the pain or take different drugs or do different things that we think, it's not a big deal. And then it becomes a bigger deal. And I'm talking about even in the church, even Christians do this, where I'll just have a little bit of alcohol to kind of take the buzz off, and then it gets to be a little bit more, and a little bit more, and then before you know, you can't even cope without a drink. It's one of those, even smoking can do this, where you just absolutely have it to just kind of wind down. And I understand that. The Bible even says not to withhold wine from those who are suffering, but I think that there's a healthy expression of this and an unhealthy expression of this. And I think that one thing we need to always remember is sometimes a crutch isn't a good thing. And, use it for a time and then you let it go. So if you find yourself in that kind of a place, I understand. I'm not judging you. I'm just saying it might be time to let that go. You might think, well, nobody sees it. It doesn't really matter if nobody sees it. It matters that you get healthy, you get better. You're in a place of suffering, I understand. Don't stay there. Don't stay there. Okay. I think I'm on 6. Yes, give it time, but here's the thing. Know when healing ends and stalling begins. All of us go through times of grieving. That's nothing new. Some of us have exceptionally difficult times of grieving. Thank God that we don't all do that. But when we go through times of grieving, sometimes we go alone and we're healing, and then we just never come back out. And just know when stalling begins and healing ends. It's important that you socialize, get back out, and see people again, live life again. If you are not going through grieving, but you know somebody who is, here's just a few quick tips to help. Number one, kind of back off. Don't take things so seriously when they say things when they're grieving, and when they say stupid things and do stupid things. Just kind of give it time. Give it time. They'll bounce back. You just got to kind of give them space. Be there as a friend. Don't take what they say too seriously. Don't feel like you have to rush to correct them. Oftentimes it's better to just kind of sit and listen. Remember in the book of Job, we looked at this last week, where his friends just had to say something. They had to correct him, and then God ends up having to correct them because they couldn't just keep their mouth shut. Remember these things. It's important. Number two, and remember that when people are suffering, the things that you say and do will have an impact for the rest of your relationship. You can know people as good as you can, but when they're going through grieving and you say something stupid and try to push them out of grief, they'll remember it, and your friendship might end. So even if they're not a Christian, you might want to just give it time. Number two, don't try to cram and force the Bible. Don't claim to know how they feel. Just let it happen naturally. If God opens a door, there's a door that opens. If not, just sit and weep with them. That's okay. Number three, if you don't have anything to say, just don't say anything at all. It's like when somebody says something stupid to you. We're getting into the holidays, you're going to have family members and stuff, and you're going to have fights that come, it happens every year. Yeah, that thing, it's going to happen again. And when that happens, you don't have to say anything. You can just keep your mouth shut, and it's really fine. Proverbs even says that people who keep their mouth shut, people think that they're wise. But people who always have their mouth open, they already know you're not. So a fourth thing you can do when you're around somebody who's grieving is watch how you say things. Oftentimes we say something like this: if you need anything, come and tell me. They're not going to tell you. They're not. If they're going to feel awkward and stupid, they're not going to come and tell you. A much better way you could ask is something like this: hey, what do you need? Or offer something specifically. Hey, can I bring you dinner? Do you want to go out? Offer something specific. And no matter how many times they say no, always be available for the time that they say yes. Okay, don't get your feelings hurt. It's nothing personal. They're just going through grieving, and they're doing it in their own way. And the fifth thing, you don't have to keep telling them how sorry you are. You know how many times I had people coming to my dad's house and sitting there crying and wailing in the driveway, and it's like then you have to comfort them when you're the one going through the grieving. I personally got a little bit tired of it. I just wanted to escape from it. I wanted to just escape from it. It was nice the first couple of days, but then after a while it's like, could we not talk about that every single time we talk? Can we talk about something else? I'm still grieving. I need space with this. I just need to process it. And that's okay. You know what I mean? You just got to kind of be sensitive to how they're grieving the process. And if they want to talk about it, let them talk about it. If they don't want to talk about it, fine. Don't push it. See what I mean? You just kind of got to roll with the punches with people who are suffering. So the last thing, you don't have to have all the answers and fix them. People are going to go through grieving. It's going to be very uncomfortable. They're going to probably cry in front of you. That's a little awkward, but there's not much you can do to stop it. I mean, you should start yelling at them, but that's probably not a good idea. If they're crying, maybe don't just sit there and stare at them and say, "Are you done yet?" But don't go anywhere and don't try. Just sit there and let them process how they process, and they'll come back around. I want you to get from grieving, and we see this from the passage that we read there in Romans, is that no amount of faith prevents your pain. No amount of faith prevents pain. We saw this with Job. This is a guy that had his act together, and yet he still went through a very painful process of grieving, losing all of his children at the same time, with no time to breathe. That's rough. And no amount of faith is going to prevent that pain from happening. So with that, I think we can all just kind of gather this all together and say this: mourn with those who mourn. You don't have to have the answers. Mourn with those who mourn. So what can we take away from this? Two things I'd like to mention. First off, feel whatever you need to feel. Sometimes in church you're gonna hear people try to rush you to feel better. You shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't feel this. You shouldn't feel this. Whatever. It's gonna pass eventually. All things do. Feel however you feel. It's not a sin to experience your emotions. It just says that in your anger, don't sin. So let yourself process it, but remember the things that you do in your grief will still be there. So if you say a bunch of stupid things, you are going to have a bunch of broken problems to fix. And so just remember that. The second thing is don't use or allow temporary feelings to make a permanent decision for you. Sometimes people do this with suicide. I'm tired of feeling. I want this to be over. There is never going to be a day when it ends, so I'm just going to end it myself. You see people do that quite a lot. I have actually dealt with many people who tune towards that. And remember, no matter how bad it is and how bad you feel, maybe it might last even 10 or 15 years, there is a way out. And suicide is just not it. It just hands the pain to somebody else. That's all it does. Doesn't end the pain, just gives it to somebody else. So remember that. And another example of a permanent decision is wrath. Right? So you go through grieving, and then you take your wrath out on somebody else. Probably not the best course of action. How you feel really isn't up to you. You're going to feel different things in your life. You're going to feel happy, sad. Sometimes you're just going to wake up, and it's like you woke up on the wrong side of the pillow, huh? You're just mad. Your spouse says something, you're just like, oh, could you be quiet for 1 second? And then the next day you wake up, and you're just like, man, I'm so happy that this is my spouse. That's something that happens. I mean, how you feel isn't always up to you, but what you do with it is very much so up to you. Very much so up to you. Feeling bad is an excuse to act bad. And when you mess up, when you're grieving and you mess up, own it, apologize for it, move on. Guilt trips don't really help. Lord, I thank you for everything you're doing in us and through us, and I pray for those who are grieving during this holiday season. It's a very rough time for a lot of people. Those who have lost children or spouses, parents. Lord, anybody here who's going through a time of grieving. It doesn't matter how long ago it was, you know very much so how they carry that with them every day. And so, Lord, I pray that you would touch them, anoint them, bring them people who will be a comfort to them. And, Lord, help them to process it and to get through it, focusing on you, Lord. I pray that you would reveal yourself to those who are in pain. And, Lord, I pray you'd equip us to help those who are grieving. And, Lord, we love you, and we thank you. Amen.